Did you know that 18th century French breakfast was such a mystery that even historians barely mention it? Most sources skip right over it. But today, we're uncovering the truth. From prisoners drinking wine with bread to aristocrats sipping bouillon, breakfast was far from what we know today. And when coffee and chocolate arrived, everything changed. Want to find out how your morning routine traces back to a revolution in a cup? Stick around. This story starts with bread, wine, and one surprising Turkish ambassador. The historian's blind spot. Breakfast is the meal we take for granted today, but historians strangely can't seem to figure it out. Think about it. We know exactly what Victorians ate for dinner, how medieval feasts were arranged, yet breakfast in the 18th century remains almost completely undocumented. The standard references don't help. The Larousse Gastronomique, that massive encyclopedia of food, doesn't even have an entry for breakfast. Experts like Alfred Franklin, who wrote entire books about meals in private French life, skipped right past it. Le Grand Dossier, whose work became the foundation for understanding French culinary history, somehow missed this daily ritual too. Travel journals from the time don't fill the gap. Visitors recording every detail of French life would write things like, "After breakfast we visited," without ever saying what that breakfast was. Accounts from servants, merchants, even prisoners mention eating breakfast, just never what they ate. There are more records describing royal hunting parties than what ordinary people broke their fast with each morning. This isn't just about missing recipes. The silence around breakfast reveals how history often ignores everyday life in favor of grand events. We know exactly how courtiers dressed for Versailles balls, but not what they ate when they woke up hungover the next day. The working class left even fewer traces. Their morning meals disappeared entirely from the record. Some scholars suggest this gap exists because breakfast was too private, too ordinary to document. While dinner parties inspired menus and paintings, morning meals happened behind closed doors. But that doesn't explain why even medical texts, household accounts, and grocery lists skip over it. Even the famous Encyclopédie of Diderot and d'Alembert, which recorded everything from philosophy to cheesemaking, barely mentions breaking fast. The few clues we have come from scattered mentions. A doctor's warning about drinking wine too early. A noble woman's complaint about cold chocolate. A traveller surprised by servants eating bread at dawn while their masters slept. These fragments suggest breakfast wasn't just one meal, but dozens, changing by class, region, and century. What makes this especially strange is that the 18th century was when modern breakfast began taking shape. Coffee arrived, chocolate became fashionable, and bread evolved from rough loaves to delicate rolls. Yet just as breakfast started looking familiar to us, historians looked away. One theory suggests the oversight persists because we still don't take breakfast seriously. Even today, nutritionists debate its importance while historians focus on real meals. But those forgotten morning bites tell us more about daily life than any state banquet ever could. The mystery deepens when you realize other cultures documented breakfast just fine. English household books listed morning meals in detail. German doctors debated the perfect breakfast foods. Only in France, the culinary capital of the age, did breakfast somehow become invisible. Modern scholars are finally piecing together the truth from household inventories, medical advice, and rare personal letters. What they're finding changes how we see the past. Not as paintings of grand occasions, but as real people starting their days. Some with wine-soaked bread, others with steaming chocolate, many with nothing at all. This blind spot reminds us that history isn't just what was written down, but what wasn't. The foods people ate when no one was watching might tell us more about their lives than any official record ever could. And for 18th century France, that story begins not with silver platters, but with whatever they grabbed first thing in the morning. Bread, wine, and the fast before coffee became the morning staple. Breakfast across much of Europe looked shockingly different to our modern routines. For centuries, the most common morning meal contained just two elements: bread and alcohol. This simple combination fueled everyone from peasants to prisoners, revealing how breakfast served basic survival needs rather than pleasure or ceremony. Ancient Romans started this tradition by soaking bread in wine first thing in the morning. By the 18th century, French workers carried on remarkably similar habits. Records show even prisoners in the Bastille received bread and wine for breakfast as standard fare. Toll House Prison in London provided beer instead, demonstrating how alcohol remained central to morning meals across Europe, despite regional variations in the drink of choice. Tobias Smollett's travel writings from 1744 noted how spirits frequently appeared on breakfast tables. He described one breakfast where a Picard peasant girl served chocolate alongside alcohol first thing in the morning. Work contracts from the era of Louis XI specify bread and wine as standard provisions, sometimes supplemented by meat or fish for higher status workers. These accounts reveal how alcohol wasn't an indulgence, but an expected part of morning nutrition. Some doctors actively discouraged morning eating altogether. Jean Sulpice's 1483 book Civility advised waiting several hours after waking before consuming anything. This reflected common medical beliefs that linked morning meals to sluggishness. Wealthier individuals sometimes followed this advice, while workers couldn't afford to skip their morning bread and drink. Legrand's records confirm many lower-class French people replaced solid breakfasts entirely with spirits when food was scarce. The consistency of this bread and alcohol pattern across centuries shows how breakfast served practical needs rather than culinary ones. Unlike elaborate dinners or ceremonial feasts, morning meals needed to provide quick energy from readily available ingredients. This explains why bread, easy to bake in bulk and keep for days, paired with wine, beer, or spirits that prevented waterborne illnesses while offering calories. Regional variations existed within this basic framework. Northern France favored beer, while southern regions drank wine. Brandy appeared in some areas, especially where grapes didn't grow well. The bread itself varied from dense rye loaves in poorer households to finer white bread among merchants. But the core concept remained: break your fast with bread, and whatever alcoholic drink was cheapest and most accessible. This tradition began fading when coffee, tea, and chocolate arrived in Europe. But even then, the old ways persisted among certain groups. Rural workers continued drinking wine at breakfast well into the 19th century, while urban poor replaced it with coffee only when prices dropped enough to compete. The transition wasn't about taste preferences so much as economics and changing ideas about health. The bread and wine breakfast reveals a key truth about historical eating habits. Convenience often outweighed enjoyment. People started their days with what was cheap, available, and minimally taxing to prepare. Unlike the lavish breakfasts we imagine from Victorian times or contemporary brunches, this was functional eating at its most basic, fuel for bodies rather than pleasure for palates. What's perhaps most surprising is how long this system endured. From Roman workers to French peasants 2,000 years later, breakfast changed remarkably little until new drinks and industrial schedules reshaped mornings. That persistence demonstrates how deeply eating habits connect to practical realities rather than shifting food fashions. Modern breakfast cereals, yogurt parfaits, and avocado toast would have baffled an 18th century worker. But their morning bread and drink might seem equally strange to us today. The real difference lies not in the ingredients, but in how we've transformed breakfast from purely functional to aspirational, a shift that began only when coffee started flowing in Parisian cafes. Can, the Turkish ambassador's gift. When the Turkish ambassador Süleyman Aga arrived in Paris in 1669, he brought more than diplomatic letters. He carried bags of coffee beans. The exotic drink he introduced to Louis XIV's court sparked immediate suspicion. Doctors warned it caused sterility. Sterility. Moralists claimed it led to impotence. Critics called it the devil's black brew. Yet within decades, this controversial substance would transform French mornings completely. French observers initially treated coffee as medicine rather than food. The Abbé de Choisy noted in 1666 that coffee, chocolate, and tea still seemed so foreign that hosts served liqueurs after meals instead. Early adopters drank it not for pleasure, but because doctors recommended it for digestion or alertness. Wealthy patients consumed it from apothecary jars, not teacups. This medicinal approach followed Europe's long tradition of consuming exotic imports as health treatments. But coffee's effects proved too noticeable to remain confined to the medicine cabinet. The first cafe opened in Marseille in 1671, introducing Parisians to the social coffeehouse culture, already popular in Istanbul and Vienna. An Armenian peddler helped spread the trend after 1672 by selling coffee door to door. When Louis XIV officially authorized the Limonadiers Guild in 1676 to sell coffee both as beans and prepared drinks, it marked a turning point. No longer just medicine, coffee became commerce. Resistance lingered in some quarters. The German Princess Palatine complained in 1712 that she preferred traditional beer soup to coffee, tea, or chocolate. Her critique revealed how these new drinks had penetrated elite circles, even as some aristocrats clung to older customs. The controversy mirrored social tensions. Was France becoming too cosmopolitan? Were foreign imports corrupting traditional values? Coffee became a proxy for larger cultural battles. By 1750, skepticism had evaporated. Legrand observed that the consumption of coffee in France has tripled since the start of the century. It became standard in bourgeois households, served after dinner and increasingly in the morning. Even working-class Parisians adopted the new habit. There is no shop girl, no cook, no chambermaid, who in the morning does not have a café au lait for breakfast. What began as an exotic medical treatment had become an everyday necessity. The rapid adoption changed French society beyond breakfast tables. Coffeehouses became hubs where writers, politicians, and businessmen gathered. Unlike taverns centered on alcohol, these new establishments fostered sober discussion and debate. The Café Procope, opened in 1686, hosted Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Rousseau. Others became unofficial stock exchanges or reading rooms. The caffeine-fueled conversations in these spaces helped shape modern France. Coffee's rise reflected deeper changes in work patterns too. As cities grew and artisanal workshops expanded, workers needed morning stimulation beyond traditional wine. Factory clocks replaced church bells in structuring the day. The energizing effects of caffeine matched perfectly with industrializing Europe's new rhythms. French workers didn't switch from wine to coffee because they preferred the taste. They needed something that fit modern work life. This seemingly small dietary shift carried political weight. The government initially taxed coffee heavily, making it a luxury. As prices dropped, its consumption became a quiet form of democratic leveling. Both bankers and servants now drank the same stimulant each morning. Coffee's journey from elite medicine to common beverage mirrored France's own transformation in the decades before revolution. Today we take morning coffee for granted, but its adoption required overcoming deep cultural resistance. That steaming cup represents centuries of medical debate, social change, and economic transformation. Next time you drink coffee, remember, you're participating in a ritual that helped shape modern Europe, one caffeinated sip at a time. The Turkish ambassador's gift didn't just change breakfast, it helped brew a new society, chocolate. From drug to delicacy, when chocolate first arrived in France, people didn't see it as food. They treated it like medicine, something you'd take from an apothecary jar, not sip from a fancy cup. The Spanish brought chocolate from Mexico in the early 1500s, where Aztecs drank it mixed with cornmeal and spices. By the time it reached France around 1653, it still carried that foreign mystique. Cardinal Alphonse de Richelieu first encountered it through Spanish nuns, who used it for digestion. When Queen Maria Theresa brought chocolate from Madrid in 1661, she introduced it to Versailles as a royal curiosity rather than a daily drink. Early reactions to chocolate ranged from suspicion to outright fear. Some doctors warned about its stimulating effects, while others praised its medicinal qualities. A Paris physician wrote in 1684, "Chocolate, well made, is so noble an invention that it should be the food of the gods, rather than ambrosia or nectar." This back and forth reflected Europe's struggle to categorize exotic imports. Were they drugs, foods, or something in between? Chocolate occupied that uncertain space for decades before becoming socially acceptable. Louis XIV helped shift perceptions when he began serving chocolate at Versailles in 1682. The king's endorsement gave it courtly prestige, though preparation remained primitive by modern standards. The Spanish drank it with water, sometimes adding vanilla and sugar. The English later experimented by mixing in milk, eggs, and even Madeira wine. French recipes eventually simplified to just cocoa, vanilla, sugar, and cinnamon, creating what many considered the purest form of the drink. The Regency period, 1715 to 1723, marked chocolate's full acceptance into French high society. The Duke of Orleans hosted exclusive chocolate breakfasts where favored courtiers gathered to drink the fashionable beverage. These gatherings turned chocolate from medical oddity to status symbol. Unlike coffee houses that welcomed diverse patrons, chocolate consumption remained largely confined to aristocratic circles at first. Its higher price and complex preparation kept it exclusive longer than coffee. Chocolate houses eventually emerged to rival coffee houses, though with a distinctly upscale clientele. While coffee shops buzzed with political debate, chocolate houses offered refined spaces for leisurely conversation. The drink's slow preparation, requiring specialized pots and constant stirring, made it impractical for quick service. This reinforced its luxury image, as only the wealthy could afford both the product and the time required to enjoy it properly. The evolution of chocolate drinking reveals broader changes in European tastes. As global trade expanded, exotic goods transitioned from rare medicines to everyday luxuries. Chocolate's path followed this pattern, first as a foreign curiosity, then a royal indulgence, finally a bourgeois treat. The French perfected its preparation just as demand grew beyond palace walls. By the late 1700s, Parisian chocolate makers had developed techniques that would influence modern production. What began as an Aztec ceremonial drink became a European status symbol through cultural adaptation. Each country modified chocolate to local tastes. The Spanish with their vanilla, the English with milk, the French with cinnamon. These variations show how global trade items get reinvented in new contexts. The chocolate we know today barely resembles its Mesoamerican ancestor, having been transformed by centuries of European experimentation. Chocolate's journey from suspected drug to breakfast staple mirrors Europe's own transformation during the Enlightenment. As science replaced superstition, mysterious imports became understood commodities. The same analytical spirit that classified plants and animals also demystified foreign foods. Chocolate's acceptance signaled a broader cultural shift, from fearing the unfamiliar to selectively embracing it. Today we take chocolate for granted, but its path to breakfast tables was anything but smooth. That morning, hot chocolate represents centuries of medical debate, royal patronage, and culinary innovation. Next time you enjoy chocolate, remember, you're tasting the result of a global exchange that reshaped European mornings forever. From Aztec rulers to French kings to modern cafes, this humble bean has worn many identities before becoming the comforting drink we know today. The aristocrats' bouillon, while the working class started their day with simple bread and wine. French aristocrats woke up to something entirely different: meat broth. This bouillon breakfast wasn't just about food, but about demonstrating status through what you didn't eat. The wealthy could afford to begin their day with something light and carefully prepared, while laborers needed hearty fare to sustain physical work. Louis XV's morning routine makes this distinction clear. His chefs prepared an elaborate bouillon using one old capon, 4 pounds each of beef, veal, and mutton. This wasn't a quick meal. It required hours of simmering by kitchen staff who rose long before dawn. The king's broth contained more meat than many peasants ate in weeks, yet it was considered a light breakfast compared to the working class's bread. Royal doctors actively promoted these broth breakfasts for health reasons. They recommended prune juice or bouillons made with salads for sluggish mornings, tailoring prescriptions to individual constitutions. This medical advice reflected the humoral theory still influential at the time. The idea that foods could balance bodily fluids and humors. A carefully prepared broth could gently stimulate digestion without overtaxing the system. The preparation methods varied by household but always signaled status. Wealthy families used specialized bouillon pots that kept the broth warm by the bedside overnight. Servants would strain it multiple times until perfectly clear, a mark of refinement. Some recipes included restorative herbs like chicory or borage, while others added medicinal mushrooms. Each household developed its own signature blend, with recipes passed down like heirlooms. English visitors often remarked on this French custom with amusement or disdain. While British aristocrats ate hearty breakfasts of meat and ale, their French counterparts sipped broth from delicate cups. The difference wasn't just culinary but philosophical. French elites saw bouillon as civilized, while the English considered it faintly ridiculous to begin the day with what was essentially soup. These broth breakfasts also reflected changing social patterns among the wealthy. As aristocrats stayed up later for evening entertainments, they rose later too. A noon breakfast of bouillon made sense for someone who danced until dawn, whereas workers needed energy at daybreak. The broth provided gentle nourishment for delicate aristocratic stomachs, supposedly upset by rich dinners and late nights. The class distinctions appeared even in the serving vessels. Silver bouillon cups became status symbols, often ornately engraved with family crests. Some had built-in spirit lamps to keep the broth warm. a luxurious touch unnecessary for common folk who drank their morning wine from plain bowls. The very act of sipping rather than chewing marked one's refinement. Records from great houses show bouillon ingredients change seasonally. Spring might bring light chicken broths with young vegetables, while winter called for richer beef stocks. Some households alternated between white broths made from poultry and brown broths from roasted meats. This variation far surpassed the monotonous bread and wine breakfast of the poor. Medical texts warned against common breakfast mistakes the wealthy might make. One 1743 health manual cautioned that drinking bouillon too hot could inflame the blood, while tepid broth might cause indigestion. The ideal temperature, like so much in aristocratic life, required precise calibration and expert servants to achieve. Interestingly, this bouillon tradition persisted even as coffee grew popular. Wealthy households might take coffee later in the morning, but the broth came first. This created a two-stage breakfast ritual. First the medicinal bouillon upon waking, then the stimulating coffee when properly dressed and ready to face the day. The broth breakfast eventually faded as medical theories changed and aristocratic influence waned. But for over a century, it represented the perfect expression of privileged 18th century life, a meal that required immense resources to produce something seemingly simple. In a society obsessed with visible status markers, what you didn't eat first thing in the morning spoke volumes. The servants' early rise, the daily rhythms of 18th century France revealed deep class divisions. Nowhere more clearly than in morning mealtimes, servants rose before dawn to light fires, draw water, and begin food preparation. Their déjeuner, literally meaning to break the fast, happened in hurried mouthfuls between chores, often standing in the kitchen. Meanwhile, their employers slept late, their curtains drawn against the morning light. Aristocratic schedules shifted increasingly later as nighttime entertainments grew fashionable. A noble, who had attended a midnight ball, might not stir until noon. Their first meal became correspondingly delayed, though they still called it déjeuner. This created linguistic confusion. The same word now described both a servant's 5 a.m. bread and cheese, and a noble's noon meal of bouillon and pastry. Eventually, the upper-class déjeuner slid so late it merged with the midday dîner, forcing the creation of new meal terms. Jane Austen's morning routine illustrates this class divide. While rising at 7 a.m., early by aristocratic standards, she wouldn't eat immediately. First came letter writing, piano practice, or household management. Servants in the same home had already been working for hours, having eaten their own breakfast in the brief lull before the family woke. Their déjeuner was fuel for labor, not leisure. The servants' 3 daily meals followed strict timing. After their morning déjeuner came the substantial midday dîner, then a lighter evening supper of bread and leftovers. Each meal fitted precisely around their duties. Kitchen staff ate only after preparing the family's meals, often taking cold plates in corners. Footmen might gulp food between answering doors. No one questioned why servants needed earlier, heartier breakfasts than those they served. It simply reflected their physical workload. Great houses developed elaborate systems to manage these staggered meals. The butler kept one clock set to family time and another to servants' time. Cooks prepared multiple breakfast services, trays for upstairs at 10 a.m., a hot buffet in the servants' hall at 7. This temporal segregation ensured classes rarely saw each other eat. The family wouldn't witness servants bolting food, nor servants observe their employers' leisurely morning rituals. The linguistic shift from déjeuner meaning breakfast to meaning lunch happened gradually. By the Revolution, Parisian society was eating petit déjeuner in the morning and déjeuner at noon, while rural servants still used the original terms. Menus from the period show this transition. A 1785 noble household document lists déjeuner à la fourchette, a fork breakfast, served at 1 p.m. alongside traditional morning meals for staff. Domestic manuals warn new servants about these timing expectations. One 1772 guide instructed maids to take your nourishment early and quickly, for you'll get no other chance till afternoon. Wealthy diarists like the Duc de Croy recorded breakfasting at 2 p.m. without seeing any inconsistency. His schedule wasn't about hunger, but about displaying his ability to disregard natural rhythms. The temporal divide extended beyond food. Servants completed laundry, shopping, and cleaning before their employers dressed. By the time aristocrats rang for their chocolate, lower staff had already worked a full morning. This schedule persisted through seasons, while summer might allow slightly later starts. Winter's early darkness meant servants rose in cold darkness regardless. Some households experimented with unifying mealtimes. The progressive Duc d'Orléans tried making staff eat at the same hours as family in the 1780s. Accounts show it failed within weeks. The kitchen couldn't serve both groups simultaneously, and servants found it impossible to complete chores on the aristocratic timetable. The experiment proved that differing meal times weren't arbitrary, but reflected fundamental disparities in how each class experienced time itself. This temporal segregation left physical evidence. Grand houses built separate staircases, ensuring servants didn't pass bedchambers in the early morning. Silver chocolate pots had thicker bases than coffee pots, keeping drinks warm for unpredictable, aristocratic waking times. Even architectural details like soundproofing allowed late-rising nobles to sleep through the clatter of servants' breakfast clean-up below. The meal timing divide didn't just reflect different schedules, but different relationships to time itself. Servants lived by the sun's natural progression and work demands. Aristocrats followed artificial social clocks. What mattered wasn't when you woke, but that you could afford to wake late. That simple difference, encoded in breakfast times, revealed deeper truths about who controlled time in pre-revolutionary society. The English breakfast beast, while the French were sipping bouillon and coffee, English breakfast tables groaned under the weight of cold meats and ale. This wasn't luxury, it was fuel. Records from London's Christ's Hospital School in 1731 show children received bread and beer for breakfast, proving even children needed substantial morning meals to face the day. The English approach to breakfast reflected their practical attitude toward food. It existed to power bodies through long work hours, not for pleasure or ceremony. Sir Walter Scott captured this perfectly in the Antiquary, where characters breakfasted on cold roast beef and mum ale. This wasn't literary exaggeration. Household accounts confirm similar meals appeared on gentry tables. Wealthy families typically served cold meats, fish, cheese, and ale each morning. Some alternated with salted herring and wine, but always maintained the protein-heavy core. These weren't casual choices, but ingrained traditions stretching back centuries. Medieval English breakfasts had established this pattern with alcoholic beverages, cold meats, and dark bread. By the 1700s, the menu expanded but retained its central purpose, providing lasting energy. Joseph Addison noted in The Tatler that English breakfasts reliably included beef, treating morning meals with the same seriousness as dinner. While the French debated whether to eat breakfast at all, the English treated it as essential as any other meal. The working class followed similar principles with humbler ingredients. Artisans ate bread, butter, cheese, and beer, the common version of wealthier spreads. Unlike France's stark class divisions in morning meals, English breakfast traditions crossed social lines. Servants and masters might eat different qualities of food, but both consumed solid caloric breakfast to start their days. This English approach reflected cultural values as much as practical needs. Physical labor dominated English life more than French society, demanding greater morning sustenance. Farmers, dock workers, and craftsmen needed protein and calories before manual labor. Even children at Christ's Hospital faced long study hours requiring energy, hence their bread and beer ration. The English breakfast also revealed different attitudes toward alcohol. While French servants might drink wine and laborers brandy, English breakfast beers were typically lower alcohol small beers. These provided hydration without heavy intoxication, practical drinks for people who needed to remain functional. The strength increased with status, as wealthier households served fuller ales, but the principle remained consistent. Meat featured heavily across all classes. Even modest households prepared cold meats specifically for breakfast. Wealthier estates served leftover roasts from the previous night, establishing the tradition of cold meat breakfasts that would last into Victorian times. Salted fish offered protein alternatives when meat was scarce, especially in coastal areas. Preparation methods emphasized convenience. Breakfast foods required minimal morning cooking: cold meats, pre-baked breads, preserved fish. This fit English households where servants rose later than their French counterparts. Without French-style pre-dawn bouillon preparations, English kitchens needed breakfast solutions allowing later starts yet energetic mornings. By the late 1700s, the contrast between French and English breakfasts grew stark. Paris embraced café au lait and delicate pastries, while London stuck to beef and beer. This wasn't just culinary preference but reflected deeper societal structures. France's emerging urban bourgeois culture versus England's labor-focused outlook. The English breakfast remained fundamentally medieval in spirit long after France modernized morning meals. Its persistence reveals how food traditions can anchor cultures against change. While fashionable continentals sipped chocolate, stolid Englishmen chewed cold mutton, maintaining routines unchanged for generations. This divide would eventually produce our modern breakfast paradox: continental simplicity versus English heartiness. Both approaches had roots in 18th century necessities that became cultural signatures. Next time you debate pancakes versus full breakfast, remember, you're replaying a centuries-old conflict between fuel and finesse. Today's English breakfast retains its DNA from these working-class origins. The modern fry-up with eggs, bacon and beans descends directly from those beef and beer mornings. What began as practical sustenance became national tradition, precisely because it worked, powering generations through English mornings long before coffee ever reached London's docks. America's colonial morning, while the French debated whether to eat breakfast, and the English piled their plates with meat, American colonists developed their own morning traditions, with some surprising justifications. Puritan settlers often turned to scripture to defend their breakfast habits, citing Genesis 18, where Abraham serves cakes and curds to angels. Exodus 16 provided another reference point, detailing how the Israelites gathered manna each morning. These biblical examples helped early colonists justify what some European doctors still questioned: the wisdom of eating first thing in the morning. Harvard students in 1635 followed a breakfast schedule that would shock modern parents. Their morning meal typically included beer alongside beef and bread, essentially duplicating English university customs. College records show the dining hall served these substantial breakfasts to sustain students through long study sessions. This reflected the colonial tendency to adapt Old World traditions to New World realities, maintaining familiar patterns despite different environments. Wealthier families expanded this basic template with imported luxuries. Inventories from Massachusetts Bay households list breakfast items like butter, cheese, and occasionally tea. One merchant's 1682 will specify a silver chocolate pot among his most valued possessions. These elite breakfasts mirrored English gentry customs while incorporating New World ingredients. Pumpkin preserves might appear alongside imported marmalade. Working-class colonists relied on simpler, locally available foods. Farmers often ate hasty pudding, cornmeal boiled in milk or water, topped with maple syrup or bacon grease. This practical dish required minimal preparation time before dawn chores. In southern colonies, rice and hominy grits became staples. Unlike the French bouillon or English cold meats, these American breakfasts centered on grains that grew well in local soil. Benjamin Franklin captured this diversity when listing colonial breakfast options in 1766. He described how corn could be prepared in a great variety of ways, alongside wheat, rye, barley, and dairy products. His assertion that he could provide a fresh variety every day in the month without repeating dishes demonstrated the colonists' culinary adaptability. This flexibility helped settlers from different European backgrounds develop shared food traditions. The timing of meals revealed social hierarchies similar to Europe's. Laborers rose before sunrise to eat quick breakfasts of bread dipped in cider or beer. Middling families might gather at 7 a.m. for heartier fare. The wealthy often delayed breakfast until 9 or 10 a.m., following aristocratic patterns from London rather than local work schedules. These staggered mealtimes maintained visible class distinctions in the supposedly egalitarian colonies. Regional differences emerged based on available ingredients. New Englanders favored saltfish and baked beans, dishes that stored well through harsh winters. Pennsylvania Dutch communities developed sweet breakfast breads using European baking techniques. Southern plantations served hoe cakes made from cornmeal on the blades of field tools. Each adaptation reflected both cultural heritage and environmental necessity. The contrast between urban and rural breakfast grew sharper as colonial towns developed. Taverns in Boston and Philadelphia began offering morning meals to businessmen by the 1720s, precursors to modern diners. These public breakfasts featured hot dishes that home kitchens rarely prepared in the morning, like eggs cooked to order. Meanwhile, frontier families still ate from communal bowls of porridge while standing near the hearth. Children's breakfasts followed adult patterns, but in scaled-down portions. Diaries describe young apprentices receiving milk toast or corn mush before chores. Wealthier children might get small beer like their English counterparts. Schoolmasters often complained about students arriving hungry, evidence that not all families prioritized morning meals equally. Religious influences continued shaping breakfast habits throughout the colonial period. Quakers promoted plain, nourishing foods without vanity, leading to oatmeal-heavy morning meals. Catholic regions like Maryland maintained European traditions of feast day breakfast treats. The Great Awakening's emphasis on personal piety brought new focus to household routines, including morning meals. By the Revolution, American breakfast traditions had diverged significantly from European models. The availability of maize, maple syrup, and cheap meat created distinctive morning menus. While Europeans debated the merits of coffee versus chocolate, colonists pragmatically drank whatever was available. Apple cider in New York, rum punch in the Carolinas, or herbal teas in frontier settlements. These adaptations didn't happen randomly. Each choice, from the Puritans' scriptural justifications to the plantation owners' hoe cakes, reflected deeper cultural values. Breakfast became another arena where colonists negotiated their identity between Old World heritage and New World realities. The resulting patterns would eventually evolve into recognizably American morning meals, but their roots lay firmly in these colonial compromises between tradition and necessity. The doctor's warning. Medical opinion in the 18th century couldn't seem to agree on breakfast. While today we debate what to eat, doctors back then debated whether to eat at all. Jean Sulpice set the tone back in 1483 with advice that influenced generations. He recommended waiting several hours after waking before consuming anything. His book Civility suggested physical and mental exercise before the first meal of the day. This wasn't fringe thinking. It reflected mainstream medical theories that linked morning eating with sluggishness. Royal medical practices supported this view. Henry III's 1585 health regimen completely omitted breakfast, scheduling the first meal at dinner time hours after waking. Seasonal adjustments were made, slightly later in summer, earlier in winter. But the principle remained. For aristocrats following medical advice, delaying food intake wasn't deprivation, but discipline. Court physicians argued that allowing the body to fully wake before eating promoted clearer thinking and better digestion. Doctors advising against breakfast often cited humoral theory, the dominant medical framework since ancient times. They believed morning meals could upset the body's delicate balance of fluids. Some warned that early eating might cause melancholy or phlegm, conditions blamed on bodily imbalances. Others claimed digestion worked best when the sun was high, making midday meals more natural. These theories persisted well into the 1700s among elite physicians. Confusingly, other medical voices completely disagreed. Rabelais, himself a trained physician, joked that breakfast gives a good memory and makes dinner even better. His comic novels portrayed hearty morning meals as beneficial, a direct contradiction of mainstream medical advice. This disagreement highlights how little consensus existed among experts about morning eating habits. Practical considerations divided medical opinions too. Laborers needing morning energy largely ignored fasting advice. They couldn't work without fuel. But aristocrats who slept late and engaged in less physical activity found delayed eating more feasible. Medical texts tailored advice accordingly, recommending light broths for delicate nobles while acknowledging workers needed solid breakfasts. The controversy extended beyond Europe. Colonial doctors debated whether tropical climates required different breakfast practices. Some argued hot weather necessitated lighter morning meals, while others insisted on substantial breakfasts regardless of location. This lack of agreement reflected medicine's primitive understanding of metabolism. Doctors observed patterns but couldn't explain the physiology behind them. Breakfast skeptics weren't entirely wrong by pre-modern standards. Without refrigeration, morning meals often featured leftovers stored since the previous night, sometimes spoiling overnight. Avoiding questionable foods made medical sense. Doctors also correctly noted that digestion slows during sleep. They just drew different conclusions about when to restart it. Medical warnings targeted specific breakfast components too. Practitioners cautioned against cold liquids first thing, believing they shocked the system. Others warned that coffee taken too early could overstimulate delicate constitutions. Even chocolate came with caveats. Many physicians advised against combining it with breakfast due to its perceived narcotic effects. The contradictions persisted because nobody could definitively prove their theories. Without nutritional science or controlled studies, physicians relied on anecdotal experience and classical authorities. A doctor who saw patients thrive after skipping breakfast naturally promoted the practice, while others saw different results. Geography played a role too. Italian physicians generally promoted breakfast, while French doctors often discouraged it. Class distinctions influenced medical advice as well. Texts intended for the wealthy emphasized fasting benefits, while guides for the working class acknowledged breakfast necessity. This double standard revealed how medical theories often served to justify existing social patterns rather than challenge them. The elite could afford to follow complicated dietary regimes. Workers just needed calories. By the late 1700s, breakfast skepticism faded as coffee and chocolate established themselves as morning staples. But the debate left traces in odd places. Specialized broth cups designed for safe morning sipping, alarm clocks for aristocrats to time their delayed breakfast properly. These artifacts remind us how seriously people took medical advice, even when doctors couldn't agree amongst themselves. The breakfast debate ultimately reflected broader tensions in Enlightenment medicine, between ancient authorities and new observations, between natural bodily rhythms and cultivated discipline. Morning meals became a proving ground where conflicting medical philosophies clashed. Next time someone tells you breakfast is the most important meal, or that you should skip it, remember this controversy goes back centuries before nutrition science settled the matter. The doctors couldn't agree then, and we still argue about it today. The linguistic time warp. The word déjeuner carried a completely different meaning in the 13th century than it does today. Derived from dé, to undo, and jeûner, to fast. It literally meant breaking the fast, the first meal after waking. This original breakfast remained consistent for centuries, until aristocratic habits began warping its meaning during the 1700s. The shift reveals how elite lifestyles could reshape language itself. As French nobles started staying up later, often until 3 a.m. after evenings of gambling, their mornings stretched later too. What began as breakfast gradually slid toward noon, colliding with the traditional midday dîner. Le Grand Dossier noted how dinner itself had already migrated from 9:10 a.m. to 1 p.m. by the 1700s, following the king's changing schedule. Each meal crept later, leaving gaping holes in daily routines, holes that would be filled by new meal terms and customs. This created confusing inconsistencies across classes. Servants still rose early, keeping the original breakfast meaning of déjeuner, eating bread or porridge at dawn before household chores. Their aristocratic employers might not sit down to their own déjeuner until noon, by which time servants were already preparing the midday meal. Two completely different meals shared one name, with timing revealing social status. You could tell someone's class just by asking what time they took their déjeuner. The shift happened first in cities, where aristocratic influence was strongest. Rural areas maintained older meal patterns longer. Farmers couldn't sleep past sunrise, even if they wanted to. A French-English dictionary from 1870 still translated déjeuner as breakfast, showing how stubbornly the original meaning persisted in some contexts. Modern French eventually solved the confusion by calling breakfast petit déjeuner, literally little lunch. But this linguistic patch only emerged after centuries of confusion. What's remarkable is how completely the old meaning disappeared from standard usage. Today, few French speakers realize déjeuner originally described breaking an overnight fast. The word became untethered from its literal meaning, shaped entirely by the habits of aristocrats who slept late and ate later. Every time someone says déjeuner for lunch today, they unconsciously echo these 18th century social shifts. Menus from great houses show the linguistic transition in action. A 1785 noble household document lists déjeuner à la fourchette, a fork breakfast, at 1 p.m. alongside staff breakfast served much earlier. The same document uses dîner for evening meals that previous generations would have called supper. This wasn't just changing words. It reflected complete reorganization of daily rhythms around elite leisure. Servants' records tell a different story. Household accounts often note breakfast expenses separately from déjeuner, confirming that staff still use the original meaning. Payroll logs show kitchen workers eating their morning meal hours before preparing the family's noon déjeuner. These parallel meal systems created logistical headaches. Kitchens had to operate on two different temporal tracks simultaneously. The linguistic leftovers linger in unexpected places. French still uses petit déjeuner for breakfast. Preserving the hierarchy, the aristocrat's big lunch became déjeuner, forcing commoners' morning meal to become the little version. Even mealtime vocabulary carried class baggage. Similar divisions appear in other languages. English dinner migrated from midday to evening, following aristocratic fashion. But few transformations were as complete as déjeuner's journey from morning to noon. This wasn't just about words. It reflected changing values. As Enlightenment ideas spread, daytime became increasingly associated with productivity rather than leisure. The old breakfast term slid later, while new words emerged for early meals, marking society's gradual shift toward valuing morning hours differently. What began as aristocrats sleeping late ended up reshaping linguistic categories that still structure our days. Next time you hear French speakers discuss lunch plans using déjeuner, you're hearing linguistic archaeology in action. That simple word carries centuries of social history, a reminder that when habits change, language often follows. The breakfast that disappeared left its ghost in the language, hiding in plain sight every noon across France. The caffeine revolution. When coffee, tea, and chocolate arrived in Europe, they brought more than new flavors. They introduced caffeine to morning routines for the first time. This sparked heated debates that sound remarkably modern. Critics warned these stimulants caused overexcitement and health risks. A Paris pamphlet from 1687 claimed coffee could make men impotent. Some physicians argued chocolate led to melancholy vapors. Princess Palatine wrote dismissively of those who ruin their stomachs with coffee. Yet supporters praised the same drinks for providing unmatched mental clarity and energy. The transformation happened fastest in cities. By 1710, Paris had over 300 coffee houses where previously taverns dominated. These new establishments fostered completely different social dynamics. Patrons debated politics and philosophy rather than drinking silently. The Café Procopie became known as a gathering place for Enlightenment thinkers. Voltaire reportedly drank 40 cups a day there while writing, a staggering amount that shows how quickly caffeine became central to intellectual work. Workers found they could discuss revolutionary ideas with clear heads rather than ale-fogged minds. Medical opinions split dramatically. One 1697 treatise claimed coffee cured everything from gout to nightmares. Another warned it caused tremors and insomnia. Chocolate faced similar divisions. Some doctors prescribed it for weak constitutions, while others banned it from patient diets. The confusion reflected medicine's inability to explain why these drinks affected people so strongly. Without modern biochemistry, physicians relied on observable symptoms and ancient humoral theories. the workplace transformed along with cafes. Merchants discovered they could review accounts more accurately after coffee rather than wine. Printers found themselves catching typesetting errors that alcohol-blurred eyes had previously missed. Even the Royal Navy eventually swapped sailors' rum ration for tea, recognizing caffeine kept crews alert during night watches. This wasn't just about pleasure. Stimulants provided practical advantages in emerging industrial society. Domestic routines adapted accordingly. Wealthy households acquired specialized coffee and chocolate pots. Middling families bought small tin coffee mills. Inventories show even modest rural homes might own a single coffee cup reserved for the head of household. The rituals around these drinks became status markers. Knowing how to properly froth chocolate or brew Turkish coffee signaled refinement. The social impacts went beyond productivity. Coffeehouses created new public spaces where classes mixed uncomfortably. A merchant might overhear university debates previously confined to private salons. Artisans could read newspapers aloud to illiterate workers. Authorities grew increasingly nervous about these uncontrolled gatherings. King Louis XIV had briefly banned coffeehouses in 1676 over political concerns. Chocolate occupied a distinct cultural niche. While coffee democratized quickly, chocolate remained expensive longer. Wealthy women adopted it as an acceptable morning drink that wouldn't overstimulate their delicate constitutions. Medicinal chocolate preparations proliferated, some mixed with amber or crushed pearls for extra refinement. The Marquise de Sévigné wrote detailed letters debating whether chocolate was healthy for her daughter. The speed of adaptation varied dramatically. By 1750, Parisian workers routinely started their day with café au lait. Yet rural laborers still preferred traditional wine or cider breakfast well into the 1800s. Aristocrats alternated between embracing and rejecting the new drinks. King Louis XV had his own coffee plants at Versailles, yet often skipped morning beverages entirely. Children became inadvertent test cases for caffeine's effects. Wealthy families gave them chocolate as a treat, while poorer children sometimes received coffee-soaked bread. Schoolmasters noted both benefits and problems. Some students concentrated better, while others grew distractible. The debate over children and stimulants began here, centuries before modern pediatric guidelines. The long-term health consequences remain difficult to assess. Historical records describe heavy users like Voltaire suffering tremors and stomach issues, clear signs of overconsumption. Others credited coffee with helping them survive grueling work schedules. The most significant impact may have been psychological. People discovered they could consciously manipulate their energy levels for the first time. What began as exotic imports became everyday necessities with astonishing speed. By the Revolution, caffeine had reshaped work patterns, social interactions, and even revolutionary politics. The coffeehouse debates of the 1780s directly fueled the political ferment that exploded in 1789. When we discuss today whether coffee improves productivity or if students should drink energy drinks, we're continuing debates that started in French cafes 300 years ago. The caffeine revolution never really ended. We just stopped noticing it because it became normal. The modern breakfast is born by the mid-1700s. Something unexpected happened in France. The morning meal that aristocrats once treated as medicinal, the bouillon sipped in bed, got simplified and democratized. Café au lait and bread became the standard breakfast across social classes. This wasn't planned. It evolved naturally as coffee consumption tripled in France. The drink that started as an exotic import became so common that even shopgirls and chambermaids expected their morning cup. Markets began selling café au lait to workers heading to their jobs. What began as an aristocratic luxury became a national habit, almost by accident. The key was simplicity. Tobias Smollett noted in 1763 that Parisian breakfast consisted of petit pain and their pails of butter alongside the coffee. At country inns, he found bread, butter and milk served in the morning. This basic template crossed all our class lines. What varied was the quality, not the concept. Wealthy households might add jam or better bread, while workers took whatever they could afford. But the core remained café au lait with something breedy. The continental breakfast was born without anyone declaring it should exist. Class differences persisted beneath the surface. Marie Antoinette kept her Viennese habit of café au lait with her favorite bread, a deliberately simple choice that still reflected royal privilege. Meanwhile, Madame de Genlis listed lavish breakfast options in her phrasebook: eggs, cream, multiple breads, showing how the upper classes expanded on the basic formula when they wanted. But even aristocrats increasingly adopted the simpler version for everyday meals. What started as a worker's practical solution became a national standard by convenience. The spread wasn't uniform. Rural areas held onto older habits longer: bread and wine, porridge, or salted meats. Travelers noted how breakfast changed between Paris and the countryside. In cities, the new model took hold quickly. Coffee's stimulating effects matched urban work rhythms better than traditional wine or beer. Shopkeepers serving morning coffee realized they could sell bread alongside it. The pairing made sense. The bread slowed caffeine absorption, preventing jitters while providing calories. The change happened so gradually that few commented on it at the time. No royal decree established café au lait as the national breakfast. People just kept choosing it. Domestic manuals began assuming this combination as the default morning meal. Household inventories show more families owning coffee equipment. Even the term shifted. Déjeuner moved toward midday, while petit déjeuner emerged to describe the light morning meal. The new breakfast reflected social changes too. As work became less physical for the middle class, heavy morning meals made less sense. Office clerks didn't need the calories that field workers did. Women running households preferred something quick to prepare. The simplicity also suited urban life. Few city apartments had space for elaborate morning cooking. Bread could be bought daily from bakeries, coffee brewed quickly on small stoves. Traditional breakfast foods didn't disappear entirely. Workers doing manual labor still ate heartier meals. Some regions kept their local customs: butter bread with cider in Normandy, garlic rubbed toast in Provence. The café au lait model became dominant, not because it was enforced, but because it fit how more people were living. This accidental standardization had long-term effects. When hotels later created the continental breakfast, they were just formalizing what French households had already adopted. The template spread abroad too. Visiting foreigners noted how sensible the light morning meal seemed compared to their heavier traditions. Today's cafe breakfasts with croissants descend directly from this 18th century shift. Looking back, the most surprising thing is how unplanned it was. No nutritionist advocated for café au lait over wine. No economic policy promoted bread consumption. People simply found a combination that worked for changing lifestyles and stuck with it. The modern breakfast emerged not through design, but through countless small choices accumulating over time. Next time you dip a pastry in coffee, remember, you're participating in a ritual that crystallized when French workers, aristocrats, and shopkeepers all independently realized the same thing tasted good in the morning. The forgotten leftovers, the debate about whether to eat breakfast, has biblical roots going back thousands of years. In 1632, physician Guy Patin pointed to Genesis 18 as proof that morning meals were sacred tradition. He specifically cited Abraham telling angels, "I will give you bread to fortify your hearts, after which you will go." Patin interpreted this as divine approval of eating in the morning to maintain strength. But there's a catch. The original passage describes this meal happening during the hottest part of the day, which could mean midday rather than morning. This shows how people stretched ancient texts to support modern habits. Exodus 16 provides clearer breakfast evidence, stating, "At even ye shall eat flesh, and in the morning ye shall be filled with bread." The passage links morning bread with evening meat as essential daily nutrition. Colonial Americans later used this verse to justify their own breakfast customs when European doctors questioned eating early. What seems like simple food advice actually shows how scripture shaped daily life. People wanted biblical approval for ordinary routines. Greek historian Xenophon's writings reveal breakfast's practical importance centuries before Christianity. In Anabasis, he describes armies completely derailed by missed morning meals. One peace negotiation stalled simply because Greek soldiers hadn't eaten breakfast, proving its impact on daily function. Xenophon didn't just report this as logistical detail. He found it humorous that world-changing diplomacy waited on something as basic as soldiers' toast. His accounts show breakfast wasn't optional for those doing physical labor. Xenophon's Cyropedia gives glimpses of Persian breakfast culture. The Persians typically ate 2 meals, morning and evening, but sometimes just one early meal if preparing for battle or work. This 2-meal pattern appears similar to the biblical model in Exodus, suggesting a widespread ancient rhythm of morning carbohydrates and evening protein. These weren't casual snacks, but carefully timed fuel for active lifestyles. Early Christians complicated these traditions by promoting fasting. Monastic rules often prohibited eating before Mass, pushing breakfast later. This created tension between ancient morning meal customs and Christian discipline. Guy Patin's biblical arguments emerged from this conflict. People needed justification to keep eating breakfast against clergy disapproval. The debate wasn't just about digestion, but about interpreting divine will. Terminology itself reveals changing attitudes. The English word breakfast only appeared around 1463, though the concept existed much earlier. French records mention breakfast as distinct from other meals by the 1200s. Language lagged behind practice. People were eating morning meals long before having a special word for them. This disconnect suggests breakfast began as informal eating rather than a proper meal. Medical texts show how breakfast alternated between necessity and vice across centuries. Some ancient Greek physicians recommended one daily meal, while medieval doctors often prescribed morning eating for laborers. The inconsistency reflects deeper uncertainties. Was breakfast natural human behavior or cultural habit? Writers kept returning to biblical and classical texts, looking for definitive answers that didn't exist. Abraham's bread offering and Exodus's morning manna became proof texts in these debates. When 17th century writers like Patin cited them, they weren't just analyzing ancient diets. They were fighting contemporary battles about proper Christian living. The fact that Exodus specifies bread in the morning but meat at evening suggests intentional nutrition planning, which early modern Europeans latched onto as divine meal timing guidance. Xenophon's military anecdotes proved equally influential, but for different reasons. His stories showed breakfast as practical necessity rather than religious custom. Where biblical arguments appealed to tradition, Xenophon provided hard evidence that missing breakfast impaired functioning, a concept still familiar today. The Greek general didn't debate meal theology. He observed that hungry soldiers made poor decisions. What began as simple observation, people eating when hungry, became enmeshed in religious, medical, and social debates. The same verses and ancient texts supported opposing views, depending on interpretation. Colonial Americans favoring breakfast could point to Exodus, while European doctors advising against it cited other passages. Nobody questioned whether ancient people actually ate as described. They just needed authoritative support for modern preferences. These historical breakfast debates never fully resolved. Some nutritionists still argue about morning meals today, proving how deeply this basic human behavior intersects with culture. The next time someone insists breakfast is the most important meal, remember, they're continuing an argument that began when people first interpreted Abraham's bread as divine breakfast endorsement. The global breakfast divide. The world never agreed on how to start the day. In 18th century Europe alone, breakfast habits split dramatically between nations. The French sipped café au lait with rolls, while the English piled their plates with beef and ale. These weren't just preferences, they reflected entirely different philosophies about morning energy. But which approach worked better? Remarkably, nobody studied this at the time. The global breakfast divide reveals more about culture than nutrition. English breakfast followed a simple logic: fuel the body. Records show laborers ate bread, cheese, cold meat and beer. Foods packed with calories for physical work. Even wealthy English families started with solid protein. One account describes rural gentry enjoying tea, coffee or chocolate, accompanied by wheat cakes, biscuits and sherry by mid-morning. This wasn't indulgence but preparation for managing estates. The English treated breakfast as essential to productivity, whether you were a farmer or a landowner. French habits pointed in the opposite direction. Parisian workers adopted café au lait not for energy but convenience. It was quick and cheap. Wealthy French households took this further, sometimes consuming only bouillon or chocolate in the morning. Their breakfasts provided minimal calories because aristocratic mornings involved conversation, not labor. The contrast was stark. English breakfasts powered physical activity, while French versions sustained social rituals. No contemporary doctors compared these systems' health impacts. Travelers noticed the difference but offered conflicting opinions. Some English visitors mocked French bouillon as insufficient, while French observers recoiled at English greasy plates. Each side assumed their approach was superior without evidence. This wasn't about science. It was cultural identity served on breakfast plates. Asian morning meals complicated the picture further. In Japan, breakfast might include rice, fish and miso soup, combining carbohydrates with protein and probiotics. Chinese households ate congee with pickled vegetables or salted eggs. These balanced meals didn't fit European extremes of heavy protein or light caffeine. The diversity proved no single breakfast was universally correct, just adapted to local conditions. Colonial breakfasts adapted European traditions to new environments. American settlers kept English hearty habits, but substituted local ingredients like cornmeal and salt pork. Spanish colonies blended European chocolate with native maize. Each hybrid reflected what was available and what memories immigrants carried from home. Breakfast became a map of both geography and cultural roots. Work patterns shaped these choices more than health considerations. Factory schedules later reinforced English-style breakfast for industrial workers needing stamina. French café culture preserved lighter morning meals suited to urban shopkeepers. Neither system accounted for long-term health. They solved immediate practical problems. The English needed energy for manual labor. The French preferred undistracted conversation. The class divide surfaced everywhere. Wealthy English could afford meat daily, while workers subsisted on bread and small beer. French aristocrats sipped chocolate, servants gulped coffee. Similar gaps appeared across continents. Japanese samurai ate elaborate breakfasts, unknown to peasants. Morning meals didn't just reflect culture, but your place within it. Religion influenced breakfast too. Islamic regions favored dates and bread before dawn prayers. Catholic Europe alternated between fasting and feasting days. Protestant cultures treated breakfast as private family time rather than social event. These weren't nutritional choices, but expressions of faith's daily rhythm. Climate played an obvious role. Northern European breakfasts emphasized fats and proteins for winter warmth. Mediterranean diets included olive oil and fruit. Tropical colonies incorporated local fruits and fish. People ate what kept them comfortable in their environment, long before modern nutrition science explained why these foods worked. The most striking similarity was how little anyone questioned their breakfast norms. People assumed their morning routine was natural rather than cultural. An English farmer wouldn't dream of starting his day with broth any more than a French aristocrat would gulp beer at sunrise. These habits felt innate because they were learned young and reinforced daily. Today's breakfast debates, carbs versus protein, big versus small, repeat these ancient patterns. The perfect breakfast still depends on where you're from and what you do. The 18th century proves there's no universal solution, only what works for your culture and circumstances. Your morning meal says less about health than about who you are. A truth as recognizable now as it was 300 years ago. Conclusion. That steaming cup of coffee you're holding tells a story centuries in the making. From French prisoners drinking wine for breakfast to aristocrats sipping bouillon, morning meals reveal more than just hunger. They show how class, medicine, and global trade shape daily life. The Turkish ambassador's coffee, the Spanish queen's chocolate, the English worker's ale, each left their mark on how we start our day. Next time you eat breakfast, remember you're tasting history. If you enjoyed this journey through forgotten morning rituals, subscribe for more stories that make the past feel fresh. What historical meal should we explore next? Let us know